Hello BookTube. I am inserting this video between my last review, which you'll remember was The World Turned Upside Down by Christopher Hill, and my next review. I think it's just perfect timing because the last review focused on the subject of freedom of expression, and my next review is going to be a novel with content that I think some readers are very likely to find problematic. Problematic content is a contemporary term, but it's not a new idea. People have always objected to encountering certain subject matter in books, but those subjects have changed over time, or it might be more accurate to say that the emphasis changes because sometimes the subject matter stays the same in general. Now seemed a good time to share the thoughts that I had about problematic content before I set up this channel. I want to do some unpacking of the concept, if you will, and of course that explains my genius choice of opening photograph. I want to establish how Heathereads will talk about books with problematic content. The first point I should make is that where problematic content is concerned, it can be easier to make a judgment about non-fiction than with fiction. Sometimes the non-fiction, the title on its own will be enough for a person to know what's going to be inside. I own a book called Devices and Desires, A History of Contraception. I mean, it says it all, doesn't it? You know exactly what you're going to be dealing with. No mysteries. Actually, when it comes to history as a subject, it's almost guaranteed that any book will be problematic. The past has been problematic in a number of ways. I mean, sometimes it's the historian who's mainly the problem. Now, a good example is William Shirer, who wrote The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich. He made several open, completely unambiguous homophobic remarks in that text. He also failed completely to document the Nazi persecution of homosexuals, and that stands out because Shirer was so thorough about documenting all other fascist abuses. Just a thought, actually, as we change pictures. Maybe I can use Shirer's book as an example of my own approach to problematic content. You can see my copy there. If you look down in the bottom right-hand corner of the photograph. If I were going to do a review about the rise and fall of the Third Reich, I would say that in all other respects, the book is very, very informative. The manuscript was thoroughly researched. You may know this or not, Shirer was a CBS foreign correspondent in Europe before and during the Second World War, and he was also present as a journalist at the 1961 trial of Adolf Eichmann. He had direct access to Nazi government documents as his primary sources. Now, regarding his homophobia, I would mention it and I would put it in context. The book was published in 1960, and Shirer's views on homosexuality, they wouldn't have been regarded as problematic then. In fact, actually quite the opposite situation. It would have been more problematic for Shirer and for his publishers, actually, if he had documented fascist persecution of homosexuals and if he'd shown any sympathy for the victims. If you're not already familiar with the Lavender Scare, look, let me just post this link to a very good mini documentary on YouTube. That'll give you an introduction. It'll also give you some idea of just how long that scare had an effect on the American public. It's quite eye-opening. So only 10 years before Shirer's book appeared in print, the Lavender Scare effectively started when the American Senate passed Resolution 280 to investigate the number of homosexuals who were employed in government positions. And that was with a view to getting them out of those positions because they were considered, and here I am quoting the resolution's own words, undesirable and a problem. Right? As I say, the documentary will really put it into sharp focus. So to my mind, it's useful to have Shirer's book read exactly the way it does, right? With his biases on full display. Because then the book suddenly becomes more informative than he even intended it to be, and more informative to you if you are considering yourself a critical reader. Because suddenly this book isn't just a history of the Third Reich, is it? It is, unbeknownst to the author and to the publishers, it's also a lesson in American 20th century cultural history and queer history. It shows up that essential hypocrisy of condemning Hitler for slaughtering Jews while not condemning or even commenting on his treatment of homosexuals. And it also demonstrates that a person can condemn fascism on the one hand without being aware that they are also, in another sense, in complete agreement with fascism. Whew. Okay, new picture. Considering that I thought this was mainly going to be a talk about fiction, I seem to have spent a lot of time not getting around to that subject. When someone is looking for new fiction, it's trickier to know what you might encounter between two covers. The write-ups that you get on the back, they're meant to make you curious enough to buy, but no publisher is going to lay all their cards on the table, so they are deliberately obscure. That's why I chose this photograph. When you read the summary of a novel, it tries to make the journey sound attractive, but at some point on the horizon, you don't know what is coming. And when I was getting my notes together about this video, it occurred to me, I kind of looked back as best I could on the history of European literature, and it seemed to me that there has been a long-standing tradition of being more transparent about content. When I say literature, I mean I'm going back before widespread literacy. I'm going back to, say, classical Greek drama. Aristotle's Poetics laid down the two categories of plays, and there were conventions for both of those forms. And Greek theatre patrons, they knew what they would and wouldn't get to see. And then centuries later, in Shakespeare's England, the groundlings who would pay their penny to see a play at the Globe, they could still rely on Aristotle's rules. They still knew that if it was a comedy, anything that seemed distressing was probably just a trick. In fact, they probably knew the trick before any of the actors playing their parts knew the trick. And ultimately, everything was going to work out for good, and there would probably be an engagement or a wedding or a party at the end. Now, tragedy, everybody knew tragedy was where all the doom and gloom and blood and death and revenge and hopelessness, that it was all in there, right? Simple. You didn't have to worry about it. Shakespeare, he played around with that formula a little bit, but not that much, not that much. I figured really it was the novel that started to change things at first. Let me explain that. If you think about the 19th century, that was the great age of the novel, right? Printing was cheap, literacy was growing. But that said, novels, they didn't have to announce themselves the way a play did. You didn't have to put up posters all over the place. And they didn't have to say whether they were tragic or comic necessarily. In England, many novelists at that time, they were going through a period where they saw it almost as a mission to describe contemporary life realistically. And it seems like, most new readers wanted that kind of material, even though, the reality of England at that time was horrible. Books didn't have any cover art the way we think of cover art. There were no back cover summaries, and you couldn't really get reviews anywhere, not on Goodreads or Amazon or BookTube. Obviously, is anybody not sure about that? There were no computers. There were personal recommendations, and I imagine that word of mouth was how readers were warned about any problematic content. But there were also cultural pressures at that time that don't exist today, so that authors wouldn't write about certain content. Although I think it's good to point out that writers eventually felt muzzled by all those cultural pressures, and they challenged them. And then the 20th century, well, that saw a really interesting split, literarily speaking. On the one hand, you had an emergence of a movement called modernism, which affected all artists, but I'm talking about the novel in particular here. Novelists felt it was time to start experimenting with different structures and styles and subject matter. And being experimental, it mattered if you wanted to be considered a serious writer. Now, if you were more concerned about just being a popular novelist, then what you might also be doing is spearheading or adding to the new fiction genres that were emerging, like crime, science fiction, and horror. Genre is a 20th century publishing phenomenon. 19th century books that we think of as horror, say Frankenstein or Dracula, or books that we think of as science fiction, Jules Verne's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, they were not they were not those genre when they were written. Those genre titles have been added retrospectively in the 20th century. And of course, as genre developed, the book industry, they started to use the book cover in kind of in the same way that in Elizabethan England you would have had play notices up. You would have known, is it a comedy? Is it a tragedy? Cover art now, with its specifically chosen typefaces and colors and graphics, if you're into crime fiction, for example, you know what a crime paperback will look like. You know what colors won't be on the cover. You know what the font will look like. You wouldn't accidentally pick up a chick lit, without realizing it, because the cover will tell you. You will know. You'll be safe. And then, of course, bookstores also, they've choreographed their interiors, haven't they? So that, say you're a science fiction, fantasy buff, there's a whole section. You can go straight to it, and you won't get bothered by all the other books. Your books, they're right there. You can't go wrong. So, and of course, the internet has supercharged that, haven't they? Because now they've got algorithms. So whatever you buy online, Amazon, or Blackwoods or whatever, Chapters, whatever site you use to get your books, they'll remember what you bought, and what they'll suggest to you is more of the same. So at the present time, it's probably the safest to be a novel reader, really, because there's so much signposting. So I guess the question that every reader has to decide for themselves is whether or not they always want a nice, safe reading journey. The reading equivalent of going to your favorite shop. This is one of my favorite shops that you see here. Ta-da! Books and collectibles. That is a journey that it's a routine trip. It doesn't really challenge your expectations. You might find something a little bit new, but not a lot new, where you can feel fairly certain that you'll get what you want every time you make that journey. If, on the other hand, a reader wants more, let's say they want reading to take them somewhere, they want reading to broaden them intellectually and emotionally, they want reading to challenge their assumptions and add depth to their understanding of the world. You see, if a reader wants that, they have to take risks, and wow, problematic content is one of those risks. Having said all that, I mean, this doesn't have to be an either or kind of choice. I'm guessing here, but I don't think I'm far wrong to say that every reader, including me, I've got my own list of safe authors, right? Now and then, I really do want to just indulge in a book that it feels familiar and safe, just like, booking a lunch table at my favorite tea room. As in, ta-da, these incredibly subtle introductions to the pictures, aren't they? But mostly I want more from my reading. I would go so far as to say that I need more. And that is why on this channel, I don't talk much about liking or disliking a book. My approach to any book is to understand it. And by that, I don't just mean understand what it is about. I want to understand the author and the time period in which it was written. So I want to understand the structure. I want to understand how the author has handled narration and character and language, setting, pace. With the novel that I'm going to review next, I'm also downloading academic articles from JSTOR to get some different critical views. See, I want a really deep connection with the book, and I want to have learned something that I didn't already know when I finished. And where there is problematic content, I deal with that. It's part of the understanding process. I want to consider, why did the author include it? I mean, were they trying to shock? Were they trying to challenge conventions? Or did their cultural circumstances mean that they weren't challenging anything? They were just going along with what everyone thought was true at the time. Handling problematic content that way, I believe, it's helpful. It leads to insights, and it adds to sort of our broad understanding of where we've been before and where we've come to now. And so I think it will be helpful for the next book review. That's a work in progress at the moment, but there's not much more progress to go. So, please hang in there. Thanks very much for tuning in to my little chat about problematic content. As always, please click the subscribe button if you want to catch that next review, and I look forward to seeing everybody again. Bye-bye.